The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of our master bathroom as Rob's voice echoed from the shower. He was on the phone again, thinking the running water would mask his conversation, but our ensuite had perfect acoustics. His words cut through the steam like a blade through silk. "Madison, sweetheart, I promise you won't have to wait much longer. The old hag is already suspicious, but she has no idea what's coming. By Christmas, you'll be Mrs. Mitchell, and Sarah will be nothing but a bitter memory with empty bank accounts." The cruel laughter that followed made my knees buckle. 20 years of marriage, 2 decades of supporting his dreams, building his empire, and this is how he saw me. An old hag to be discarded for a woman young enough to be our daughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I pressed my back against the cool bathroom wall, my heart hammering against my ribs as the full weight of betrayal crashed over me. Rob Mitchell, my husband of 20 years, was planning to destroy me for a 20-year-old Instagram model named Madison Parker. The same Madison whose photos I'd noticed him liking obsessively over the past 6 months. The same girl he'd hired for those supposed marketing campaigns for his real estate development company, Riverside Properties. The water shut off abruptly, and I heard Rob moving around in the shower. Panic flooded my system as I realized I was standing in a pool of broken glass, evidence of my eavesdropping scattered across the bathroom floor. My hands shook as I quickly gathered the larger pieces, wrapping them in a towel while my mind raced. I needed to get out of there before he emerged. Needed time to process what I'd just heard. "Sarah?" Rob's voice called from behind the frosted glass door. "Everything okay out there?" I heard something break. "Just dropped my water glass," I called back, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm cleaning it up now." 20 years of marriage had taught me to be an excellent actress when necessary. All those corporate events where I'd smiled through his condescending introductions, where he'd referred to me as his little marketing consultant, while I'd built million-dollar campaigns for Fortune 500 companies. All those dinner parties where I'd laughed at his jokes while he flirted with younger women right in front of me. I'd been performing for so long that deception had become second nature. But this performance was different. This time, I was playing for my life. I finished cleaning the glass and retreated to our walk-in closet, sitting heavily on the velvet bench where I'd gotten ready for countless social events as Rob's dutiful wife. The same closet where I'd hung the designer dresses he'd bought me for appearances, where I'd stored the jewelry he'd given me for anniversaries and birthdays. Gifts that I now realized were just props for the role he'd assigned me in his life's performance. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Rob was in that shower, washing off what I assumed was evidence of his affair with Madison, I was finally seeing our marriage clearly for the first time. Every late night at the office, every business trip that seemed to coincide with Madison's modeling gigs in different cities, every time he'd come home smelling like unfamiliar perfume and claimed it was from client meetings. The signs had been there for months, but I'd been too trusting, too invested in preserving our life together to see them. What Rob didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn despite 2 decades of marriage, was that his quote, little marketing consultant wife had spent 15 years before their wedding working in corporate investigation. Before I'd met him at that charity gala in downtown Riverside Heights, before I'd fallen for his charm and ambition, I'd been Sarah Coleman, senior investigator for Morrison & Associates, specializing in corporate fraud, embezzlement, and digital forensics. I'd given up that high-stress career when we'd married, choosing instead to build my own marketing consultancy that would allow me the flexibility to support Rob's growing real estate empire. I told myself I was trading the adrenaline of corporate investigation for the stability of marriage and entrepreneurship. Now I realized I'd simply been preparing for the most important investigation of my life. The bathroom door opened, and Rob emerged in his silk robe, hair damp and face flushed from the hot shower. He looked younger than his 52 years, kept in shape by personal trainers, and enhanced by regular trips to his dermatologist. I'd always been proud of how well he'd aged, how distinguished he looked in his custom suits at industry events. Now I saw him, through Madison's eyes, a successful older man with money and power, the kind of trophy husband a young woman might pursue for security and status. "You look tired, sweetheart," he said, approaching me with what I'd always thought was genuine concern. Maybe you should get some rest. I've got some paperwork to finish up downstairs. More phone calls with Madison, no doubt. More planning for my destruction. I am feeling a bit worn down, I admitted, though not for the reasons he assumed. I think I'll take a bath and turn in early. Rob smiled and kissed my forehead, the same gesture he'd made thousands of times during our marriage. His lips felt cold against my skin, and I had to suppress a shudder of revulsion. How long had these displays of affection been performance? How long had he been counting down the days until he could be free of his aging wife? Good idea. I'll try not to wake you when I come up. He wouldn't be coming up. I knew from previous experience that his late-night paperwork sessions often stretched until the early morning hours. Tonight I suspected he'd be on video calls with Madison, planning their future together while I supposedly slept upstairs, oblivious to my impending doom. After Rob left the bedroom, I ran a bath and tried to think clearly about what I'd overheard. He'd mentioned that I was already suspicious, which meant he'd noticed changes in my behavior that I hadn't even realized I was making. He'd referenced empty bank accounts, which suggested he was planning to hide or transfer our assets before filing for divorce. And he'd mentioned Christmas as their timeline, which gave me less than 4 months to figure out what he was planning and how to protect myself. The water was scalding, matching the fury that was building in my chest. For months, I'd been attributing the changes in our relationship to normal marital ebbs and flows, to the stress of his expanding business, to my own insecurities about aging in a youth-obsessed culture. When he'd started making comments about my appearance, suggesting I might consider freshening up with cosmetic procedures, I'd assumed he was trying to be helpful. When he'd encouraged me to spend more time at the gym, to update my wardrobe, to try new hairstyles, I'd thought he was invested in keeping our marriage vibrant. Now I understood he'd been comparing me to Madison, finding me lacking, and preparing to replace me with a younger model. The realization was devastating. But it was also clarifying. The fog of self-doubt that had been clouding my judgment for months lifted, replaced by the sharp focus I'd once brought to corporate investigations. I soaked in the bath until the water began to cool, my mind shifting from emotional processing to strategic planning. If Rob was planning to leave me with empty bank accounts, he had to be moving money somewhere. His real estate development company had dozens of properties in various stages of development, multiple business partnerships, and complex financial arrangements that would provide plenty of opportunities to hide assets. Finding those hidden assets would require the same skills I'd used to trace money laundering operations and expose corporate fraud 15 years ago. The difference was that this time, it was personal. This time, I wasn't just helping a client recover stolen funds or exposing corporate malfeasance. I was fighting for my own survival, my own future, my own dignity. And unlike the corporate criminals I'd investigated in the past, Rob had no idea what kind of adversary he was facing. As I dried off and prepared for bed, I made a mental inventory of the resources available to me. My marketing consultancy gave me access to sophisticated digital tools and databases that most people couldn't access. My client base included executives from major corporations, attorneys, financial advisors, and other professionals who might be useful allies. My college friend Lisa Chen was now a detective with the Riverside Heights Police Department, and my business partner, Marcus Thompson, had advanced technical skills that could be invaluable in gathering digital evidence. Most importantly, I had something Rob didn't expect. I was underestimated. He saw me as a 48-year-old woman whose best years were behind her, whose skills were limited to creating marketing campaigns for small businesses, whose value was primarily decorative. He had no idea that he'd spent 20 years living with someone who specialized in unraveling exactly the kind of complex financial schemes he was apparently planning. I slipped into bed and turned off the lights, but sleep was impossible. My mind was racing with possibilities, with plans, with the beginnings of a strategy that would expose not just Rob's affair, but whatever illegal activities he was using to hide our marital assets. The hurt was still there. The devastation of realizing that the man I'd loved and trusted for 20 years saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to his happiness. But underneath the pain, something else was growing. Determination. Rob thought he was dealing with a naive, aging wife who would be easy to discard. He thought Madison was his ticket to a younger, more exciting life. He thought his money and power would protect him from consequences. He was about to learn how wrong he was on all counts. From downstairs, I could hear the low murmur of his voice as he settled into his office for another late-night conversation with his 20-year-old replacement. Let him make his plans, let him coordinate his strategy with Madison. Every word they spoke was potentially evidence. Every plan they made was another thread I could pull to unravel his scheme. I'd spent 15 years helping corporate clients expose financial crimes and recover stolen assets. Now I was going to use those same skills to protect myself from the biggest betrayal of my life. Rob Mitchell was about to discover that his aging wife was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. And Madison Parker was about to learn that replacing a woman like me would come with consequences she'd never anticipated. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 11:47 p.m. In less than 4 months, Rob expected to be free of his old wife and starting a new life with his young replacement. Instead, he was going to find himself facing the most thorough investigation of his life, conducted by someone who knew all his secrets, all his weaknesses, and all his crimes. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of destroying the man who thought he could destroy me. Tonight, I would lie in our bed and listen to him plan my downfall, gathering intelligence and preparing for a war he didn't even know had begun. The prey was about to become the predator, and Rob Mitchell had no idea what kind of hunter he'd been living with for 20 years. The morning sun filtered through our bedroom curtains as I listened to Rob's alarm buzz at exactly 6:30 a.m., the same time it had been set for the past 5 years. His routine was predictable. 15 minutes of stretching, 30 minutes in his home gym, shower, coffee, and out the door by 8:15 for his first appointment. Today, however, I noticed details I'd overlooked before. The way he checked his phone immediately upon waking, the slight smile that crossed his face as he read what I now knew were messages from Madison, the extra care he took with his appearance as he prepared for another day of deceiving me. I feigned sleep as he moved around our bedroom, watching through barely opened eyes as he selected his clothes. The navy Tom Ford suit I'd helped him pick out for his birthday last year, the Italian leather shoes I'd given him for Christmas, the platinum watch that had been our 10th anniversary gift. Everything I'd chosen to make him look successful and distinguished, now being worn to impress a woman half my age. After Rob left for the office, I moved quickly into action. My first priority was confirming what I'd overheard the night before and gathering more specific information about his plans. I went to his home office, a space I'd respectfully avoided during our marriage, understanding that everyone needed their private workspace. That respect had been a mistake. The room was immaculate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Everything organized with the precision of someone who had secrets to protect. His desktop computer was password protected, but I knew Rob well enough to guess his combinations. He'd always been creatures of habit, using variations of significant dates and names. After 3 attempts, I gained access using Madison 2024, a password that made my stomach turn. The desktop wallpaper had been changed from a photo of us on our last anniversary to a generic landscape image. Even in his private space, he was erasing our history. His email revealed months of correspondence with Madison that went far beyond a professional relationship. The messages started innocuous enough, discussing her modeling portfolio and potential advertising campaigns for his properties. But they quickly escalated into intimate conversations about their future together, detailed discussions of travel plans, and most disturbingly, strategies for what Rob called transitioning away from my current domestic situation. One email thread particularly caught my attention. Rob had been consulting with an attorney named Charles Brennan about restructuring his business assets. The messages were carefully worded to avoid direct admission of intent to hide marital property, but the implications were clear. Rob was moving money through a series of property transactions, creating a complex web of ownership that would make it nearly impossible for me to claim my rightful share in a divorce settlement. Another series of emails showed correspondence with a private investigator named Kevin Bradley. Rob had hired him 6 months ago, ostensibly to conduct background checks on potential business partners. But reading between the lines, I realized Bradley was investigating me, looking for any information that could be used to discredit me or support grounds for divorce that would minimize Rob's financial obligations. The most chilling discovery was a folder labeled Timeline Documentation. Inside were detailed records of every argument we'd had over the past year, every time I'd questioned his late nights or business trips, every moment of marital discord carefully cataloged and twisted to support a narrative of an unhappy marriage. Rob was building a case to claim that our relationship had been deteriorating long before Madison entered the picture, that I was an unstable, suspicious wife who had driven him away through my own behavior. I photographed everything with my phone, creating a digital record that I could access even if Rob discovered my investigation and changed his passwords. The evidence was damning, but it was also incomplete. I needed to understand the full scope of his financial manipulations and identify all the players in his scheme to destroy me. My hands were trembling as I restored his computer to exactly how I'd found it and left his office. The betrayal ran deeper than a simple affair with a younger woman. Rob had been systematically planning to financially devastate me while constructing a legal narrative that would paint me as the villain in our marriage's collapse. The man I'd loved and trusted for 20 years had been treating our relationship like a business acquisition that had outlived its usefulness. I made coffee with shaking hands and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about Rob wanting to start over with Madison. This was about him wanting to destroy me completely, to leave me with nothing while he rode off into the sunset with his young trophy wife and all the wealth we'd built together. The cruelty was breathtaking, but it was also strategically brilliant. If I hadn't overheard that phone conversation, if I hadn't started investigating, I would have walked blindly into his trap. My phone buzzed with a text message from my business partner Marcus Thompson, asking about our afternoon meeting to discuss the Henderson account. Marcus was brilliant with technology and had a natural talent for digital investigation that had made our marketing consultancy incredibly successful. More importantly, he was completely trustworthy, someone I could confide in without worrying about information getting back to Rob through our mutual social circle. I called him immediately, my voice still shaky from what I'd discovered. Marcus, I need to move our meeting up. Something's happened, and I need your help with a personal matter that requires your particular skills. Marcus had worked with me long enough to recognize the tone in my voice. Sarah, what's wrong? You sound upset. I can't discuss it over the phone. Can you meet me at the office in an hour? And Marcus, this conversation needs to stay completely confidential, no matter what I tell you. Of course. I'll be there in 45 minutes. The drive to my office gave me time to organize my thoughts and decide how much to reveal to Marcus. Our business partnership had grown into a genuine friendship over the past 5 years, and I trusted his judgment completely. He'd also been through a difficult divorce himself and would understand the emotional complexity of what I was facing. My office was located in a converted warehouse in Riverside Heights Arts District, a space I'd chosen specifically because it was far from Rob's real estate development projects and the corporate circles where we might encounter mutual acquaintances. The building housed several small creative businesses, providing the perfect cover for discreet meetings and confidential work. Marcus arrived carrying 2 coffee cups and wearing the concerned expression of someone who knew something serious was happening. He was in his early 40s, divorced, with a teenage daughter who spent alternate weekends with him. His own experience with marital betrayal had left him cynical about relationships but fiercely protective of his friends. All right, Sarah, what's going on? You look like you haven't slept. I hadn't planned to break down, but seeing Marcus's familiar, worried face triggered an emotional release I'd been suppressing since the night before. The whole story poured out, overhearing Rob's conversation with Madison, discovering the emails and legal consultations, realizing the scope of his plan to financially destroy me. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. That bastard, he said when I finished. I never liked him, you know. Too smooth, too concerned with appearances. But this is beyond anything I imagined. Sarah, you realize he's been planning this for months, maybe longer? I know. And what's worse is how stupid I feel for not seeing it sooner. All the signs were there, but I kept making excuses, kept believing his explanations. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. Stop that right now. You trusted your husband, which is what married people are supposed to do. He's the one who betrayed that trust, not you. And Sarah, he has no idea who he's messing with. You've exposed corporate fraud schemes that destroyed billion-dollar companies. A cheating real estate developer is nothing compared to what you've handled before. His confidence in my abilities was exactly what I needed to hear. Marcus was right. I'd spent 15 years unraveling complex financial crimes, following money trails through offshore accounts and shell companies, exposing corruption at the highest levels of corporate America. Rob's scheme was sophisticated for a small-town real estate developer, but it was amateur hour compared to the international money laundering operations I'd investigated in my previous career. I need your help gathering digital evidence, I said, pulling out my phone to show him the photos I'd taken. I can handle the financial investigation, but I need someone who can recover deleted files, trace digital communications, and create admissible evidence chains. Marcus studied the images, his technical mind already analyzing the information. This is good intel, but we need more. If he's moving money through property transactions, there will be digital trails everywhere. Bank transfers, contract modifications, deed recordings, insurance policies. And if he's been planning this for months, there will be years of communications we can recover. What about his phone records? Text messages with Madison, calls to his attorney and private investigator? Definitely recoverable if we can get access to his devices or accounts. Sarah, I hate to ask this, but do you still have access to his personal information? Social security number, phone account details, anything that would let us legally access his digital footprint. I thought about the filing cabinet in our home office where Rob kept copies of all our important documents. As his wife, I had legitimate access to joint accounts and shared information. I can get whatever you need. We're still married, and half of those accounts are legally mine anyway. Perfect. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to create a secure server where we can store all the evidence we gather. Everything will be encrypted and legally admissible if this ends up in court. Then we're going to systematically map out his entire financial network, identify every asset he's trying to hide, and build a case that will not only protect you in the divorce, but potentially expose him to criminal charges. The relief I felt at having an ally, someone who understood both the technical and emotional aspects of what I was facing, was overwhelming. Marcus wasn't just offering to help. He was approaching this with the same professional intensity we brought to our most complex client investigations. There's something else, I said, remembering the private investigator. He hired someone named Kevin Bradley to investigate me. I need to know what kind of information Bradley has gathered and how Rob plans to use it against me. Marcus's expression hardened. A PI investigating his own wife? Sarah, that's not just preparing for divorce, that's preparing for character assassination. We need to find out what lies they're planning to tell about you and get ahead of their narrative. We spent the next 2 hours developing a comprehensive investigation strategy. Marcus would handle the technical aspects, recovering digital evidence, and tracing financial transactions. I would focus on the human intelligence side, identifying Rob's collaborators, and understanding their individual motivations and vulnerabilities. Together, we would build a case that would not only protect me from Rob's scheme, but turn his own weapons against him. The plan was ambitious but necessary. Rob had spent months preparing to destroy me, using his money, connections, and legal resources to create an overwhelming advantage. But he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed I was just a marketing consultant who would be helpless against his sophisticated scheme. He had no idea that he'd declared war on someone with 15 years of experience, destroying people who thought they were untouchable. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope for survival, but hope for victory. Rob wanted to replace me with a 20-year-old and leave me with nothing? I was going to expose his crimes, recover every penny he'd tried to steal, and make sure that both he and Madison understood exactly what kind of woman they'd chosen to betray. The war was just beginning, and Rob Mitchell had no idea what kind of adversary he was facing. But he was about to learn that underestimating a 48-year-old woman with my particular skills was the biggest mistake of his life. That evening, I sat in our living room pretending to read while Rob worked late in his office, probably planning more aspects of my destruction with Madison and his various accomplices. Let him plan. Every email he sent, every phone call he made, every financial transaction he authorized was creating more evidence for the case I was building against him. The hunter had become the hunted, and Rob didn't even know the chase had begun. Tomorrow, I would start gathering the evidence that would not only save me but destroy him. And when it was over, when he was facing criminal charges and financial ruin while I rebuilt my life with the assets he'd tried to steal, he would finally understand that his biggest mistake wasn't falling for a 20-year-old. His biggest mistake was underestimating his wife. The next morning brought a crystalline clarity that I hadn't felt in months. While Rob went through his morning routine, checking his phone for messages from Madison and preparing for another day of elaborate deception, I was mentally cataloging every detail of our shared life that could provide evidence of his crimes. 20 years of marriage had given me intimate knowledge of his habits, his weaknesses, his patterns of behavior when he thought no one was watching. I waited until Rob left for his first appointment before returning to his office, this time with a more systematic approach to evidence gathering. Marcus had provided me with a small device that could copy the entire contents of computer hard drives, and I'd practiced using it on my own laptop until the process became second nature. The device worked silently, creating a complete mirror of Rob's computer files while I maintained watch at the window for any sign of his unexpected return. While the device worked, I photographed the contents of his filing cabinets, paying particular attention to financial documents that had been modified recently. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Rob had been systematically transferring ownership of our most valuable assets to shell companies and business partnerships that excluded me entirely. Properties we'd purchased together during our marriage were now held by entities with names like RMP Holdings and Riverside Development Trust, legal structures designed to hide assets from divorce proceedings. The documentation was meticulous and clearly the work of an attorney who specialized in asset protection strategies. Charles Brennan wasn't just helping Rob prepare for divorce. He was helping him commit what amounted to financial fraud on a massive scale. The timestamps on the documents showed that this planning had begun 8 months ago, long before I'd had any suspicion of Madison's existence. Most disturbing of all was a folder containing detailed financial projections for what Rob called post-transition lifestyle planning. The documents outlined his expected expenses for supporting Madison, including projections for luxury travel, designer clothing allowances, and the cost of maintaining a young wife's social media presence. There were budgets for cosmetic procedures, personal trainers, and entertainment expenses that revealed just how thoroughly Rob had planned his new life with his replacement. The contrast with his projections for my post-divorce situation was stark. Rob's attorney had calculated the absolute minimum alimony payments he could legally get away with, factoring in strategies to claim that my marketing business made me financially independent. They'd even researched precedents for reducing spousal support when the recipient was deemed capable of self-sufficiency, despite the fact that I'd sacrificed career advancement for 20 years to support Rob's ambitions. I photographed every page, every calculation, every cold-blooded analysis of how to leave me with as little as possible while maximizing his resources for his new life with Madison. The documents revealed a level of planning and calculation that went beyond simple marital betrayal into something approaching criminal conspiracy. The hard drive copying finished just as I heard a car door slam outside. My heart raced as I quickly restored Rob's office to its original state and moved to the kitchen, where I began preparing lunch as if I'd been there all morning. Through the window, I saw it was just our neighbor Mrs. Chen returning from her grocery shopping, but the close call reminded me how dangerous this investigation was becoming. Rob returned home for lunch, as he did every Tuesday, claiming he needed the midday break to maintain his productivity. Now I understood he was probably using these lunch breaks for video calls with Madison or meetings with his attorney. I served him the sandwich and soup I'd prepared, playing the role of the devoted wife while mentally cataloging every word he said for potential future evidence. "You seem distracted today," he observed, studying my face with what I'd once thought was loving concern. "Everything all right?" "Just thinking about the Morrison campaign," I lied smoothly. "They want to expand their digital presence, and I'm trying to figure out the best strategy." Rob's expression shifted slightly, and I realized he was probably wondering if my business success might complicate his divorce strategy. The irony was perfect. He'd spent years dismissing my work as insignificant, but now my professional competence was potentially threatening his plans to portray me as financially dependent. "Maybe you should consider scaling back your client load," he suggested carefully. "You've been working so hard lately, and I worry about the stress affecting your health." Another piece of his strategy became clear. He wanted me to reduce my business income to support his argument that I was financially dependent on him. Every suggestion, every seemingly caring comment was part of his larger plan to manipulate me into a weaker position for the coming divorce proceedings. "That's sweet of you to worry," I replied, maintaining my performance as the unsuspecting wife. "But the business is finally hitting its stride. Marcus and I are talking about expanding into new markets." The mention of expansion clearly bothered Rob, though he tried to hide his reaction. His plan required me to be vulnerable and dependent, not successful and self-sufficient. Every achievement in my business was potentially undermining his strategy, which explained why he'd been subtly discouraging my professional growth for months. After Rob returned to his office for the afternoon, I called Marcus with an update on the evidence I'd gathered. His technical analysis of Rob's computer files had revealed even more damaging information, including deleted emails that showed coordination with Madison going back almost a year. "Sarah, this is bigger than we initially thought," Marcus said, his voice tense with anger. "Your husband hasn't just been planning to leave you. He's been systematically destroying evidence of your contributions to his business success, while building a legal case to claim you were never really a partner in building his wealth." "What do you mean?" "I found deleted files that show he's been removing your name from business documents, modifying contracts to exclude your involvement in major deals, even editing the history of your joint financial accounts to minimize your contributions. It's like he's been erasing you from your own life story." The revelation was devastating, but not entirely surprising. Rob had always been skilled at rewriting history to suit his needs, taking credit for successes while shifting blame for failures. Now he was applying those same skills to our marriage, creating a fictional narrative where I'd been nothing more than a dependent wife who'd contributed nothing to our shared success. "There's more," Marcus continued. "I traced some of the shell companies he's been using to hide assets. Several of them are connected to his business partner Trevor Hamilton, and there are financial transactions that look suspiciously like money laundering. Sarah, I think your husband might be involved in more than just marital fraud." The possibility that Rob's crimes extended beyond betraying me personally was both horrifying and oddly hopeful. If he was involved in criminal activity that went beyond our marriage, it meant there might be federal agencies interested in investigating him for reasons that had nothing to do with our divorce. What kind of money laundering? Property transactions that don't make economic sense. Rapid buying and selling of real estate at inflated prices. Cash payments that exceed normal market values. Classic signs of using real estate to clean dirty money. If I'm right, your husband's business isn't just successful because he's good at development. It's successful because he's helping criminals legitimize illegal profits. The conversation with Marcus lasted another hour as we discussed the implications of what we'd discovered. Rob wasn't just a cheating husband trying to hide assets from his wife. He was potentially a criminal who'd been using our marriage as cover for illegal activities, and now that he wanted to replace me with Madison, he needed to eliminate me as a potential witness to his crimes. Everything made sense now. The elaborate asset hiding, the character assassination campaign, the careful legal maneuvering to leave me with nothing. Rob wasn't just trying to start a new life with a younger woman. He was trying to destroy me because I represented a threat to criminal enterprises that went far beyond our personal relationship. The realization should have terrified me, but instead it filled me with a cold determination. Rob thought he could use me and then discard me like an outdated business asset. He thought his money and connections would protect him from consequences. He thought his young replacement would be too naive and starstruck to ask dangerous questions about the source of his wealth. He was wrong on all counts, and I was going to prove it to him in the most devastating way possible. The investigation was no longer just about protecting myself from a cheating husband. It was about exposing a criminal network and ensuring that Rob faced justice for every life he'd damaged in pursuit of his selfish ambitions. As I sat in our living room that evening, listening to Rob make another late-night phone call from his office, I felt a smile cross my face for the first time in months. He thought he was planning my destruction, but he was actually providing me with more evidence for his own downfall. The prey had indeed become the predator, and Rob Mitchell was about to discover that his biggest mistake wasn't underestimating a 48-year-old woman. His biggest mistake was thinking he could commit crimes for years without consequences, then try to destroy the one person who had the skills and motivation to expose everything he'd done. Tomorrow, the real investigation would begin. The morning sunlight streamed through my office windows as I spread out the financial documents I'd photographed from Rob's files, arranging them in chronological order across my conference table. The pattern that emerged was even more damning than I'd initially realized. Each transaction, each asset transfer, each legal document told a story of systematic deception that went back years, not months. Rob hadn't just decided to betray me recently. He'd been laying the groundwork for my destruction almost from the beginning of his relationship with Madison. The earliest documents showed subtle changes to property deeds and business partnerships that had occurred over 18 months ago. At the time, Rob had explained these modifications as routine business restructuring designed to protect our assets from potential lawsuits. I'd trusted his explanations, even signed papers without reading them carefully because I believed my husband had our best interests at heart. Now I could see that every signature I'd provided had been another step in his plan to legally separate me from the wealth we'd built together. Marcus arrived at precisely 9 o'clock. Carrying a laptop bag and wearing the focused expression he typically reserved for our most complex client projects. He'd spent the previous evening analyzing the digital evidence we'd gathered, and his findings were written across his face before he spoke a word. "Sarah, we need to talk about what I found in your husband's deleted files," he said, setting up his laptop on my desk. "This situation is worse than either of us imagined, and it's not just about financial fraud anymore." The screen filled with recovered email chains that painted a picture of criminal activity spanning multiple states and involving dozens of conspirators. Rob's real estate development business was apparently the centerpiece of a money laundering operation that helped drug dealers, human traffickers, and other criminals convert illegal profits into legitimate-seeming real estate investments. "Look at this transaction pattern," Marcus explained, highlighting a series of property purchases and sales. Properties are bought with cash at inflated prices, held for minimal time periods, then sold to shell companies controlled by the same criminal networks. The profits are reinvested in legitimate developments that generate clean income streams. Your husband isn't just a successful developer. He's been washing dirty money for some very dangerous people. The revelation explained so much about Rob's business success over the past few years. Properties that should have taken months to sell were moving within weeks. Developments that should have required extensive financing were being funded with cash from mysterious investor groups. Construction projects that should have operated on tight margins were generating enormous profits that seemed to defy normal market economics. "There's more," Marcus continued, opening another file. "I found communications between Rob and Trevor Hamilton that reference something they call problem resolution services. Based on the context, it appears they help their criminal clients eliminate threats to their operations. People who ask too many questions, witnesses who might testify against them, business partners who become liabilities." My blood ran cold as the implications sank in. "Are you saying they've hurt people?" "I'm saying the evidence suggests they've made people disappear, Sarah. And based on what I'm seeing in Rob's recent communications with his attorney and private investigator, they're planning to add you to that list." The conversation I'd overheard between Rob and Madison took on an entirely new meaning. When he'd talked about resolving the, quote, old wife situation, he wasn't just planning to divorce me and leave me financially ruined. He was planning to eliminate me entirely, just like they'd eliminated other threats to their criminal enterprise. The private investigator Kevin Bradley wasn't just gathering information to use in divorce proceedings. He was documenting my daily routines, my travel patterns, my security vulnerabilities. The vitamin supplements Rob had been encouraging me to take weren't just part of his psychological campaign to make me feel old and unattractive. They were potentially part of a slow poisoning scheme designed to make my eventual death appear natural. "We need to go to the FBI," I said, my voice shaking as the full scope of the danger became clear. "This isn't just about protecting me from a bad divorce anymore. These people are killers, and they're planning to murder me. Marcus nodded grimly. I agree, but we need to be careful about how we approach this. If Rob and his associates have been operating for years without detection, they probably have law enforcement contacts who provide them with protection. We need to find federal agents who are completely outside their influence network. The next several hours were spent researching FBI field offices and identifying agents who specialized in financial crimes and organized criminal enterprises. We needed investigators who had no connection to the Riverside Heights area, no prior involvement with Rob's business associates, and no reason to alert him that he was under investigation. While Marcus handled the technical research, I focused on gathering additional evidence that would support our claims about Rob's criminal activities. The financial documents I'd photographed contained references to dozens of properties and business transactions that could be verified through public records. If we could demonstrate the pattern of money laundering conclusively enough, federal agents would have grounds to begin their own investigation. The work was methodical and exhausting, but it was also strangely satisfying. For months, I'd felt powerless and confused, unable to understand why my marriage was deteriorating, despite my efforts to be a supportive wife. Now I understood that the problems in our relationship had nothing to do with my behavior, and everything to do with Rob's criminal activities, and his need to eliminate me as a potential witness. By midday, we'd identified a federal task force in Los Angeles that specialized in interstate money laundering operations. The task force was led by Special Agent Patricia Walsh, a veteran investigator with a reputation for dismantling complex criminal networks. More importantly, she had no known connections to anyone in Rob's business or social circles. I'm going to create an encrypted communication channel, Marcus explained as he set up secure email accounts and file-sharing systems. We need to present our evidence to Agent Walsh in a way that protects us from retaliation, while demonstrating the credibility of our claims. The process of organizing our evidence took most of the afternoon. Every financial transaction needed to be documented with supporting public records. Every email communication required verification and context. Every claim about criminal activity needed to be backed up with hard evidence that would stand up in federal court. As we worked, I found myself thinking about the other women who might have been in my position over the years. Had Rob been married before? Had previous wives discovered his criminal activities and been resolved through Trevor Hamilton's problem elimination services? The thought that I might not be the first woman Rob had planned to murder for the sake of his criminal enterprise was almost too horrifying to contemplate. Sarah, I found something else, Marcus said, his voice tight with anger. There are email exchanges between Rob and Madison that suggest she's not just his naive young replacement. She's actively involved in planning your elimination. The screen showed intimate communications between my husband and his 20-year-old lover that went far beyond romantic fantasies about their future together. Madison was providing detailed information about luxury lifestyle expectations, but she was also offering suggestions about how to handle the Sarah problem in ways that would minimize risk to their relationship. One particularly chilling exchange showed Madison researching accidents that had befallen other women in similar situations, providing Rob with examples of how wives had died in ways that didn't trigger intensive investigations. She'd found cases of women who'd died in car crashes after their husbands had taken out large life insurance policies, wives who'd suffered fatal falls after expressing suspicions about their marriages, even instances of women dying from apparent medical emergencies that occurred just before scheduled divorce proceedings. She's not just a gold-digging college student, I said, staring at the evidence of Madison's calculating involvement. She's an active participant in planning murder. It gets worse, Marcus replied, opening another file. I traced her background through social media and public records. Madison Parker isn't even her real name. She's actually Madison Chen, and she has a criminal record for identity theft and insurance fraud in Nevada. She's been running romance scams on older men for years, and her relationship with Rob appears to be her most ambitious project yet. The revelation that Madison was an experienced criminal rather than an innocent young woman manipulated by my husband added another layer of complexity to the situation. This wasn't a crime of passion or a midlife crisis gone wrong. It was a carefully planned criminal conspiracy between two experienced predators who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their latest scheme. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rob asking if I'd be home for dinner. The casual tone of the message, as if he were just a loving husband checking in with his wife, was obscene given what I now knew about his plans. I responded affirmatively, knowing that maintaining normal appearances was crucial until we could get federal protection. "How much time do we have?" I asked Marcus as we prepared to send our evidence package to Agent Walsh. Based on the timeline references in their communications, they're planning to act within the next 2 weeks, he replied. There's mention of a business trip Rob is planning to take, which would provide him with an alibi when your quote-quote accident occurs. The business trip was news to me, but it fit perfectly with Rob's pattern of deception. He'd probably tell me he was traveling to inspect potential development sites, while actually remaining in the area to oversee my murder. Madison would likely be with him, providing additional alibi support, while also ensuring she was far from the crime scene when it happened. We spent the final hour of the afternoon crafting a comprehensive report for Agent Walsh that laid out every aspect of Rob's criminal enterprise and the immediate threat to my life. The document was 37 pages long and included over 200 pieces of supporting evidence, from financial records to email communications to behavioral analysis that demonstrated the sophistication of their operation. "This is solid work," Marcus said as we prepared to transmit the report through encrypted channels. "If Agent Walsh is half as good as her reputation suggests, she'll recognize the validity of what we're presenting and authorize an immediate investigation." As I drove home that evening, I felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. Terror because I now understood that my husband was planning to murder me within days, and relief because I finally understood the full scope of what I was facing and had taken decisive action to protect myself. The house felt different when I entered, as if the walls themselves were contaminated by the knowledge of what Rob was planning. Every shared memory, every moment of apparent happiness during our marriage, was now tainted by the understanding that I'd been living with a criminal who saw me as a temporary convenience, rather than a beloved partner. Rob was in his office when I arrived, door closed and voice low as he conducted another in his series of mysterious phone calls. I could hear fragments of conversation that now carried sinister meaning, references to, quote, timeline acceleration, and final preparations that I understood were related to planning my death. I prepared dinner with hands that shook only slightly, proud of my ability to maintain composure despite the circumstances. Playing the role of the unsuspecting wife had become crucial for my survival, and I drew on every acting skill I developed during years of corporate presentations and client negotiations. When Rob emerged from his office, he was carrying a bouquet of roses and wearing the charming smile that had first attracted me 20 years ago. The gesture that once would have touched my heart now filled me with revulsion, knowing it was probably part of his psychological preparation for becoming a grieving widower. "For my beautiful wife," he said, presenting the flowers with a theatrical flourish. "I know I've been distracted with work lately, and I wanted to remind you how much you mean to me." The performance was flawless, delivered with exactly the right combination of romance and regret that would later support his narrative about being a devoted husband, devastated by his wife's tragic accident. I accepted the roses with appropriate gratitude, while mentally cataloging every detail of his behavior for the federal investigators, who would soon be analyzing his actions. "They're lovely," I replied, arranging the flowers in a vase while fighting the urge to throw them in his face. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion, except wanting to appreciate the woman I married," Rob said, moving behind me to wrap his arms around my waist. "I've been thinking a lot about our future lately, about all the adventures we still have ahead of us." The irony was suffocating. Rob was talking about our future while actively planning to end my life, embracing me with the same hands that had typed instructions for my murder, speaking words of love while coordinating with his criminal associates to eliminate me as a threat to their operation. "I love you too," I lied, turning in his arms to look directly into his eyes. "No matter what challenges we face, I know we'll handle them together." Something flickered across Rob's expression, so quickly I might have imagined it. Was it guilt? Uncertainty? Or was he simply calculating whether my words indicated suspicion that might require acceleration of his timeline? We had dinner together like a normal married couple, discussing mundane topics while both of us harbored secrets that would have destroyed any pretense of normalcy. Rob asked about my work with apparent interest, probably gathering final intelligence about my schedule and commitments that could affect his planning. I provided cheerful updates about client projects while mentally reviewing every word for potential security implications. After dinner, Rob announced he had work to finish and disappeared back into his office. I cleaned up the kitchen with methodical precision, using the mundane task to calm my nerves while listening for any indication of what he might be planning. The house was quiet except for the occasional murmur of his voice as he made more calls to his conspirators. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Package received and under review. Will contact you tomorrow morning with initial assessment. Maintain normal routine and take no unnecessary risks. PW Agent Walsh had received our evidence and was already beginning her evaluation. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope that I might survive Rob's murder plot and see him face justice for his crimes. The federal government was now aware of the threat, and I had allies who understood the danger I was facing. I went to bed early, claiming fatigue while actually wanting to minimize the time I had to spend pretending normalcy with Rob. As I lay in our bed, listening to him move around downstairs in his office, I thought about how completely our relationship had been revealed as a fraud. Everything I'd believed about our marriage, every moment of happiness I'd treasured, every plan we'd made for our future together, had been built on lies and manipulation. But I'd survived the discovery, and I was fighting back with weapons Rob had never expected his aging wife to possess. The investigation skills he'd dismissed as irrelevant hobby work were about to destroy his criminal empire. The business connections he'd ignored were providing me with crucial support. The intelligence he'd underestimated was systematically dismantling every aspect of his scheme. Rob Mitchell thought he could murder his way to happiness with a young criminal who shared his complete lack of conscience. Instead, he was about to discover that his biggest mistake wasn't choosing to betray his wife. His biggest mistake was choosing to betray a wife who had the skills, resources, and determination to destroy him completely. The next morning would bring new challenges and new evidence, but it would also bring federal protection and the beginning of justice for every victim Rob and his associates had harmed over the years. The prey had become the predator, and the hunt was just beginning. My phone rang at exactly 7:23 a.m., the unknown number immediately recognizable as the secure line agent Patricia Walsh had established for our communications. I answered on the second ring, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Agent Walsh. I've reviewed your evidence package with my team, and we're initiating an immediate federal investigation. Your husband's operation is significantly larger than you initially realized, and the threat to your life is imminent. We need to meet this morning to coordinate your protection and gather additional intelligence. The relief was overwhelming, but Agent Walsh's tone carried an urgency that reinforced just how dangerous my situation had become. How immediate is the threat? Based on communications we've intercepted since receiving your evidence, your husband and his associates are planning to act within the next 48 hours. We have surveillance teams monitoring their movements, but we need your cooperation to gather the final pieces of evidence that will ensure successful prosecution of the entire network. Agent Walsh outlined a plan that was both terrifying and brilliant in its simplicity. I would continue my normal routine while wearing recording devices that would capture Rob's final planning conversations. FBI agents would be positioned throughout our neighborhood, ready to intervene the moment Rob made any move against me. Most importantly, they would simultaneously raid the locations of every known associate in the money laundering network, preventing anyone from destroying evidence or fleeing the jurisdiction. There's one more thing, Agent Walsh continued. We've discovered that Madison Chen has been operating similar romance scams against wealthy men in 3 other states. Your case isn't just about protecting you from your husband. It's about dismantling a criminal enterprise that has defrauded and possibly murdered multiple victims across the country. The meeting location was a secure FBI field office an hour's drive from Riverside Heights. I told Rob I was meeting a potential new client in San Bernardino, a lie that fit perfectly with my normal business travel patterns. He seemed pleased by my continued focus on work, probably calculating how my absence would simplify his plans for staging my accident. The federal building was imposing and reassuring in equal measure. Its concrete and steel construction, a stark reminder of the serious forces now aligned in my protection. Agent Walsh was waiting in a conference room surrounded by whiteboards covered with photographs, financial charts, and timeline maps that showed the stunning scope of Rob's criminal activities. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to understand exactly what we're dealing with here," Agent Walsh began, gesturing to a wall-sized diagram that connected Rob's operation to criminal networks in 6 states. "Your husband isn't just a successful real estate developer who got involved with the wrong people. He's a founding member of what we're calling the Pacific Coast Money Laundering Consortium, a criminal enterprise that has processed over $200 million in illegal profits over the past 5 years. The numbers were staggering, but what shocked me even more were the photographs of other women whose faces had been marked with red X's across their images. Who are these women? Wives, girlfriends, and business partners who became liabilities to the organization," Agent Walsh explained grimly. "We've identified at least 7 suspicious deaths over the past 3 years that follow the same pattern your husband is planning for you. Apparent accidents that occurred just before these women could expose criminal activities or claim significant financial assets. One photograph particularly caught my attention, a beautiful blonde woman in her early 40s who looked remarkably similar to me. The case file showed she'd been married to one of Rob's business associates in Nevada and had died in a car crash just days before filing for divorce. The similarities to my situation were too precise to be coincidental. This is how they operate," Agent Walsh continued. "They identify wealthy men who are vulnerable to romantic manipulation, usually because of failing marriages or midlife crises. Madison and women like her seduce these targets while gathering intelligence about their financial assets and criminal activities. When the original wives become suspicious or inconvenient, they're eliminated in ways that appear accidental but transfer maximum wealth to the criminal organization. The revelation that I'd been targeted by a sophisticated criminal network rather than simply betrayed by an unfaithful husband was both terrifying and oddly validating. My instincts about the changes in Rob's behavior hadn't been paranoia or jealousy. They'd been accurate assessments of genuine danger. Agent Walsh introduced me to the technical team that would be supporting the final phase of the investigation. They fitted me with recording devices so small and sophisticated that they were virtually undetectable, even during intimate conversations. The equipment would transmit real-time audio to surveillance teams positioned around our house, ensuring that federal agents would hear any conversations that indicated imminent danger. "Your job is to act naturally while encouraging your husband to discuss his plans," explained Agent Rodriguez, the technical specialist who was calibrating my equipment. "Don't ask direct questions that might arouse suspicion, but try to engage him in conversations about your future together, your upcoming travel plans, anything that might cause him to reveal specific details about the timeline for your murder." The drive home felt surreal, knowing that federal agents were following at a discreet distance, while recording equipment captured every sound in my car. I practiced casual conversations in my head, rehearsing how I would encourage Rob to discuss his plans without revealing my awareness of his intentions. Rob was waiting when I arrived home, standing in our kitchen with what appeared to be genuine excitement about something. "How did the client meeting go?" he asked, moving to embrace me with an enthusiasm that would have seemed romantic if I hadn't known he was calculating the optimal time to kill me. "Very well," I replied, allowing him to hold me while the recording equipment captured every word. "They're interested in a major digital marketing campaign that could take months to complete. It would mean a lot of travel, but the financial potential is enormous." Rob's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and I realized my mention of long-term business commitments was complicating his timeline for eliminating me. If I was beginning a major project that would require my presence for months, my sudden death would raise more suspicions than if I died during a quiet period in my business calendar. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said, though I could hear the calculation in his voice. "When would you need to start traveling for this project?" "Next month, probably. They want to begin with focus groups in several major markets before developing the creative strategy." The lie flowed smoothly, designed to pressure Rob into revealing whether he planned to act before my supposed business travel began. "Next month," Rob repeated thoughtfully. "That's sooner than I expected. Sarah, I've been thinking we should take a vacation together before you get caught up in another big project. Maybe this weekend? I know a beautiful resort in the mountains where we could reconnect." The suggestion of an immediate getaway sent chills down my spine. An isolated mountain resort would provide the perfect location for staging my accidental death, far from witnesses and with difficult terrain that could explain a fatal fall or car accident. Rob was accelerating his timeline in response to my fictional business commitments. "This weekend?" I asked, trying to sound pleased rather than terrified. "That's very last minute, but it sounds romantic. What made you think of it?" "I've been feeling like we're drifting apart lately," Rob said, his performance as the concerned husband almost convincing. "I want to spend quality time together before life gets complicated again." Madison mentioned how much her parents enjoyed their recent trip to Pine Valley Resort, and it gave me the idea. The casual mention of Madison was clearly intended to gauge my reaction, to see if I'd become suspicious about his relationship with her. But it also revealed that Madison was actively involved in planning my murder, providing suggestions about locations and methods that would appear naturally motivated. "Madison certainly seems to have good taste," I replied carefully. "I'd love to see Pine Valley Resort. Should I pack anything special?" "Just comfortable clothes for hiking and casual dining," Rob said, his eyes never leaving my face. "The mountain air will be perfect for clearing our heads and talking about our future." Every word carried double meaning now. The hiking clothes would be necessary for staging my fatal accident on mountain trails. The casual dining would provide alibis for when Rob claimed to have been with me before discovering my body. The conversation about our future was particularly cruel, given that Rob was planning to ensure I had no future at all. That evening, Rob was unusually attentive, bringing me wine and suggesting we watch a romantic movie together. His performance as the devoted husband was flawless, complete with gentle touches and loving glances that would have been convincing to anyone who didn't know about his murder plans. The recording equipment captured every moment of his elaborate deception. "I love you, Sarah," he said during a particularly romantic scene in the movie, taking my hand and looking directly into my eyes. "I know I haven't always been the best husband, but I want you to know that you mean everything to me." The words were spoken with such apparent sincerity that I almost found myself believing them, despite knowing they were lies intended to establish his emotional state for future police interviews. Rob was rehearsing his role as the devastated widower, perfecting the performance he would give after my death. "I love you too," I replied, squeezing his hand while the recording equipment documented his psychological manipulation. "No matter what happens, I want you to remember that." Something in my tone must have struck him as odd, because Rob studied my face with sudden intensity. "That's a strange thing to say. Sarah, you're not planning anything reckless for this hiking trip, are you? I worry about you sometimes, especially when you get focused on work stress." The question was clearly designed to establish grounds for claiming I'd been suicidal or emotionally unstable, providing an explanation for my upcoming death that would deflect suspicion from him. Rob was already laying the groundwork for his defense, creating evidence that I'd been struggling with depression or anxiety that might lead to fatal recklessness. "Of course not," I said with a laugh that sounded genuine. "I'm looking forward to our getaway. It'll be good to spend uninterrupted time together." Rob seemed satisfied with my response, returning his attention to the movie while I mentally reviewed every detail of our conversation for Agent Walsh's team. The recording equipment had captured his timeline for my murder, his method for psychological manipulation, and his strategy for avoiding suspicion after my death. My phone buzzed with a text message that appeared to be from my dental office confirming an appointment, but I recognized it as a coded communication from the FBI surveillance team. They had received clear audio of Rob's plans and were positioning additional agents around Pine Valley Resort to ensure my safety during the planned murder attempt. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Rob made preparations for our supposedly romantic weekend getaway. He packed hiking equipment with suspicious enthusiasm, including rope and emergency medical supplies that could serve double purposes in staging my accident. He also made several phone calls that I couldn't hear completely, but which included references to, quote, final arrangements and, quote, cleanup protocols. I packed my own bag with equal care, including the additional recording equipment Agent Walsh had provided for capturing evidence during the actual murder attempt. The devices were disguised as ordinary personal items, ensuring that Rob's final conversations with Madison and his associates would be documented, even if he thought we were completely isolated. Madison called while Rob was loading our car, her voice sickeningly sweet as she wished us a wonderful romantic weekend together. "I hope you and Sarah have the most amazing time," she said, knowing full well that she was talking to a man who was planning to murder his wife within the next 24 hours. The mountains are so beautiful this time of year, and the hiking trails offer such spectacular views. The conversation was brief but revealing, with Madison making several references to specific trail conditions and weather forecasts that suggested intimate knowledge of Rob's murder plan. She wasn't just his romantic replacement, she was an active accomplice in planning my death. As we drove toward Pine Valley Resort, Rob maintained his performance as the loving husband excited about our romantic getaway. He pointed out scenic views, discussed dinner plans, and talked enthusiastically about the hiking trails we would explore together. To any outside observer, we would have appeared to be a happily married couple enjoying a spontaneous vacation. But I could see the tension in his hands as he gripped the steering wheel, could hear the forced quality in his laughter, could sense the predatory calculation behind every seemingly innocent comment. Rob was driving me to my intended murder scene while pretending to plan our romantic reconnection. The resort was even more isolated than I'd feared, nestled in a valley surrounded by steep mountain trails that would provide perfect cover for staging an accidental death. The registration desk clerk commented on how quiet the resort was during weekdays, noting that we might be among the few guests hiking the more remote trails. "Perfect," Rob replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're looking forward to having the mountains to ourselves." Our room was luxuriously appointed with a stunning view of the trails where Rob intended to kill me. He suggested we take an evening walk to, quote, "scout the hiking routes for tomorrow," his casual tone masking the fact that he was conducting reconnaissance for my murder. The trail he chose was narrow and treacherous, with steep drop-offs that would make a fatal fall seem completely plausible. Rob walked slightly behind me, ostensibly being a gentleman, but actually calculating the optimal location for pushing me to my death. The recording equipment captured his breathing pattern changes and muttered comments as he evaluated potential murder sites. "This spot has an amazing view," he said at a particularly dangerous overlook. "We should definitely come back here tomorrow morning when the light is better for photographs." I agreed enthusiastically, while noting that the location was perfect for staging an accidental fall, isolated enough that no one would witness what actually happened, with terrain that would explain severe injuries consistent with an accident. Rob was finalizing his murder plan while pretending to plan our photographic opportunities. We returned to the resort for dinner, where Rob was charming and attentive, playing the perfect husband for the restaurant staff who would later testify about our apparently happy relationship. He ordered champagne to celebrate our, quote, second honeymoon, creating witnesses who would remember him as a loving husband devastated by his wife's tragic accident. "To our future together," he said, raising his glass in a toast that was obscene given his actual intentions. "May we have many more adventures in beautiful places like this." I matched his toast while the recording equipment captured his final manipulation before attempting to murder me. Tomorrow morning, Rob intended to lead me back to that overlook and push me to my death, then return to the resort claiming to have discovered my body after I failed to return from a solo morning hike. But what Rob didn't know was that federal agents were already positioned around the resort, ready to intervene the moment he made any threatening move. The recording equipment would capture his confession when he attempted to murder me, providing irrefutable evidence of premeditated homicide. Most importantly, Madison Chen and the entire money laundering network would be arrested simultaneously, preventing anyone from destroying evidence or fleeing justice. That night, as Rob slept peacefully beside me, probably dreaming about his future with Madison and the wealth he thought he would inherit after my death, I stared at the ceiling and marveled at how completely his plan had backfired. He'd spent months calculating every detail of my destruction, never realizing that his aging wife possessed exactly the skills needed to expose his criminal empire. Tomorrow morning would bring justice not just for me, but for every victim Rob and his associates had murdered over the years. The women whose photographs I'd seen in Agent Walsh's office would finally have their deaths avenged. The families who'd been destroyed by the money laundering network would see their loved ones' killers brought to justice. Rob Mitchell thought he was taking his wife on a romantic getaway that would end with her accidental death and his freedom to start a new life with Madison Chen. Instead, he was walking into a federal trap that would destroy everything he'd built through years of criminal activity. The alarm clock showed 3:47 a.m. when I heard Rob's phone buzz with an incoming message. He checked it carefully, thinking I was asleep, then smiled with satisfaction at whatever he'd read. Madison was probably confirming final details of their plan, completely unaware that federal agents were monitoring all her communications. Dawn was still hours away, but I knew that when the sun rose over Pine Valley Resort, it would illuminate the end of Rob Mitchell's criminal career and the beginning of justice for every life he'd destroyed in pursuit of his selfish ambitions. The prey had become the predator, and tomorrow Rob would discover that his biggest mistake wasn't planning to murder his wife. His biggest mistake was choosing to murder a wife who had the skills, resources, and federal support necessary to destroy him completely. The next morning arrived with crystalline mountain air and the kind of spectacular sunrise that would have been romantic under different circumstances. Rob woke up energetic and apparently excited about our planned hike, his performance as the loving husband continuing seamlessly from the night before. "Perfect weather for hiking," he observed, checking his phone for what he claimed was a weather update, but which I knew was probably final coordination with Madison and his criminal associates. "The trail conditions should be ideal for reaching that scenic overlook we found yesterday." I agreed enthusiastically while mentally preparing for what I knew would be Rob's attempt to murder me within the next few hours. The recording equipment was functioning perfectly, transmitting every word to the federal agents positioned around the resort. Agent Walsh had confirmed through coded text messages that surveillance teams were ready to intervene the moment Rob made any threatening move. We ate breakfast in the resort restaurant, with Rob maintaining his charming demeanor for the staff, who would later be questioned about our final meal together. He ordered my favorite coffee and suggested sharing a pastry, gestures that would support his narrative about being a devoted husband shocked by his wife's tragic accident. "I'm so glad we decided to do this," Rob said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Sometimes we get so caught up in our daily routines that we forget to appreciate what we have together." The irony was suffocating. Rob was talking about appreciating our relationship while calculating the exact moment when he would push me off a cliff. His performance was flawless, complete with loving gazes and gentle touches that would have convinced anyone who didn't know about his murder plans. As we prepared to leave for our hike, Rob made a show of checking my hiking boots and adjusting my backpack straps, ostensibly being protective, but actually ensuring that I wouldn't be able to maintain my balance when he pushed me toward the cliff edge. He also insisted on carrying the emergency supplies, claiming he wanted to lighten my load but actually ensuring that I wouldn't have access to safety equipment when I needed it most. The trail was even more treacherous in daylight, with loose gravel and steep drop-offs that would make a fatal fall seem completely believable. Rob guided me toward the same overlook we'd visited the evening before, his casual conversation masking the fact that he was leading me to my intended murder scene. "This view is even more beautiful in the morning light," he said as we approached the cliff edge. "Sarah, come stand right here where you can see the entire valley." The location he indicated was exactly where I'd expected, positioned so that a sudden push would send me tumbling down a rocky slope that would cause fatal injuries while appearing to be the result of an accidental fall. Rob was positioning himself behind me, preparing to strike while I was supposedly admiring the scenery. "It really is spectacular," I said, moving toward the edge while knowing that federal agents were watching through high-powered scopes, ready to intervene the moment Rob made his move. I can see why Madison's parents enjoyed their trip here so much. The mention of Madison was calculated to provoke Rob into revealing his true intentions, and the effect was immediate. His expression shifted from loving husband to cold-blooded killer as he stepped closer, his hands reaching toward my back to deliver the fatal push. "Yes," he said, his voice taking on a different quality as his mask finally slipped. "Madison has excellent taste in many things. She's going to love spending your money, Sarah. She's going to love living in your house, sleeping in your bed, wearing the jewelry you'll never get to enjoy again." The confession was exactly what Agent Walsh needed to authorize the arrest. Rob's hands made contact with my back, beginning the push that would have sent me to my death, when federal agents emerged from concealment positions around the overlook. FBI, step away from your wife and put your hands where we can see them. Rob's shock was complete and instantaneous. His carefully planned murder attempt had been interrupted at the crucial moment, and he was surrounded by agents with weapons drawn and voices commanding his immediate surrender. The transformation from confident killer to terrified criminal was stunning to witness. "What is this?" he stammered, raising his hands while his mind struggled to process how his perfect plan had been destroyed. "Sarah, what's going on? Why are there federal agents here?" "Because I know everything, Rob," I said, finally able to drop the pretense that had protected me for the past week. "I know about the money laundering, the murders, your plan to kill me for Madison. I know about Kevin Bradley's investigation and Charles Brennan's asset-hiding strategies. I even know that Madison Chen isn't her real name and that she's been running romance scams for years." The color drained from Rob's face as he realized the full scope of what had been discovered. His elaborate criminal enterprise, years in the making, had been completely exposed by the wife he'd planned to murder. The recording equipment had captured his confession to planning my death, providing irrefutable evidence of premeditated murder. Agent Walsh appeared from behind a cluster of trees, her weapon drawn and her expression grimly satisfied. "Robert Mitchell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, racketeering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right." As Rob was handcuffed and read his Miranda rights, my phone buzzed with notifications that confirmed the simultaneous arrests of Madison Chen, Trevor Hamilton, Charles Brennan, Kevin Bradley, and a dozen other associates in the money laundering network. Years of criminal activity had been dismantled in a single coordinated operation. The drive back to Riverside Heights was surreal, watching Rob in the back of a federal transport vehicle while I rode with Agent Walsh, who was coordinating the massive evidence recovery operation that would ensure successful prosecution of the entire network. "We found over $50 million in hidden assets in accounts controlled by your husband and his associates," Agent Walsh informed me. "As his wife, you'll be entitled to recover your share of legitimate marital property, but the criminal proceeds will be forfeited to compensate the victims of their operation." The financial recovery was important, but what mattered most was knowing that Rob and his criminal associates would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. The women whose murders they'd disguised as accidents would finally have justice. The families they'd destroyed would see their loved ones' killers face consequences. 3 months later, I sat in federal court as Rob was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for his role in multiple murders and the money laundering conspiracy. Madison Chen received 25 years for her participation in the romance, scam, and murder plot. Trevor Hamilton and the other associates received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. The trial had been a media sensation, with journalists fascinated by the story of the wife who'd exposed her husband's criminal empire and survived his attempt to murder her. But I'd avoided most of the publicity, preferring to focus on rebuilding my life and helping other victims of financial elder abuse. My marketing consultancy had evolved into a specialized practice helping law enforcement agencies investigate financial crimes and supporting families who'd been victimized by romance scams. The skills that had saved my life were now protecting other vulnerable people from predators like Rob and Madison. I'd also started a foundation to support women who'd been targeted by criminal conspiracies disguised as romantic relationships. Too many women had died because they trusted the wrong person, and I was determined to prevent other families from experiencing the devastation that Rob had tried to inflict on mine. The house in Riverside Heights had been sold, with the proceeds divided between victim compensation and my new life in a smaller community, where I could focus on meaningful work rather than maintaining appearances. I'd kept only a few personal items from my marriage to Rob, photographs and mementos from the early years before I'd unknowingly become involved with a criminal enterprise. On the first anniversary of Rob's arrest, I received a letter from Agent Walsh informing me that the investigation had led to additional prosecutions in multiple states and the recovery of over $200 million in criminal proceeds. The Pacific Coast Money Laundering Consortium had been completely dismantled, and several other women had been saved from murder plots similar to what I'd experienced. The letter also mentioned that Madison Chen had been attempting to run a new romance scam from prison, targeting wealthy men through pen pal correspondence. Some people, Agent Walsh noted, never learned from their mistakes. I kept that letter in a frame on my desk, a reminder of how completely Rob's plan had backfired, and how justice had been served for every victim of his criminal empire. He'd thought he could murder his way to happiness with a young criminal who shared his complete lack of conscience. Instead, he discovered that his biggest mistake wasn't underestimating a 48-year-old woman. His biggest mistake was choosing to betray a woman who had the skills, resources, and determination to destroy everything he'd built through years of criminal activity. The prey had become the predator, and Rob Mitchell was spending the rest of his life in a federal prison cell, probably still wondering how his perfect murder plan had been turned against him so completely. The courthouse steps felt different beneath my feet as I descended them for the final time, knowing that Rob's sentencing hearing had concluded with justice served in ways I'd never imagined possible. The media circus that had surrounded the trial was finally winding down, with reporters packing up their equipment and moving on to the next sensational story. But for me, this moment represented something far more significant than the end of a high-profile criminal case. It marked the complete transformation of my life, from victim to victor, from prey to predator. From a woman who'd been systematically betrayed to someone who'd orchestrated the downfall of an entire criminal empire. The federal prosecutor David Kim caught up with me as I reached my car, his expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal admiration. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you one more time for your courage throughout this investigation. Without your willingness to put yourself at risk, we never would have gathered the evidence needed to dismantle this network. You've saved countless lives." His words carried weight beyond simple gratitude. The investigation that had begun with my discovery of Rob's affair had ultimately exposed a criminal conspiracy that spanned 7 states and involved over 40 conspirators. The money laundering operation had processed nearly $300 million in illegal proceeds over 6 years, funding everything from drug trafficking to human smuggling. Most horrifically, we documented 17 suspicious deaths of women who'd threatened to expose various aspects of the network's activities. "I just did what anyone would do to protect themselves," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Most people in my situation would have simply filed for divorce and tried to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their marriage. They wouldn't have had the investigative skills to uncover a complex criminal conspiracy, the emotional strength to maintain deep cover while gathering evidence, or the strategic thinking to coordinate with federal law enforcement while their husband planned their murder. "That's where you're wrong," Prosecutor Kim said with a slight smile. "What you did required exceptional intelligence, remarkable courage, and skills that most people simply don't possess. You didn't just save yourself, Sarah. You became the key to bringing down one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations we've ever encountered." As I drove away from the courthouse, I reflected on how completely my life had changed over the past 18 months. The naive woman who'd trusted her husband implicitly and dismissed her own suspicions as paranoia had been replaced by someone who understood the true nature of predatory behavior and possessed the tools to fight back against it. The transformation hadn't been easy, and there were still moments when the emotional trauma of Rob's betrayal felt overwhelming, but I'd emerged from the experience stronger and more purposeful than I'd ever been. My new home in Boulder, Colorado, was a deliberate contrast to the ostentatious luxury Rob had insisted on in Riverside Heights. The modest craftsman bungalow sat on 2 acres of wooded land that provided privacy and peace without the isolation that had made me vulnerable to Rob's manipulation. Every room reflected my authentic tastes, rather than the carefully curated image Rob had demanded we maintain for his business associates and social circle. The home office I'd created was the heart of my new professional life, equipped with the same sophisticated investigation tools I'd used to expose Rob's crimes, but now dedicated to helping other victims of financial fraud and romantic manipulation. The Sarah Mitchell Consulting Group had grown from a one-woman operation into a team of 12 specialists who worked with law enforcement agencies, attorneys, and victim advocacy organizations across the country. Our most successful cases involved exposing romance scams targeting elderly individuals, investigating suspicious deaths of wealthy widows and widowers, and tracing hidden assets in high-net-worth divorce proceedings. The skills I developed during 15 years of corporate investigation combined with the hard-won expertise gained from surviving Rob's criminal conspiracy, had created a unique practice that filled a crucial gap in the legal system's ability to protect vulnerable people from sophisticated predators. Marcus Thompson had relocated to Boulder to serve as my business partner and chief technology officer, bringing his digital forensics expertise to cases that often involved complex cybercrime elements. Our friendship had deepened through the shared trauma of the investigation, and his unwavering support had been crucial to my emotional recovery from Rob's betrayal. "Sarah, we need to discuss the Morrison case," Marcus said as he entered my office carrying a thick file folder and wearing the serious expression that indicated he'd discovered something significant. "The financial evidence you requested has revealed patterns that go beyond simple asset hiding. I think we're looking at another organized criminal network, possibly connected to the trafficking operations your husband's group was laundering money for." The Morrison case involved a wealthy widow in Denver, whose adult children suspected their stepfather of financial abuse and potentially planning their mother's death to inherit her estate. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward case of elder financial abuse was revealing connections to known criminal organizations and suspicious patterns that suggested involvement in much larger criminal enterprises. "What kind of patterns?" I asked, settling into the analytical mindset that had become second nature during complex investigations. "Property transactions that mirror the money laundering techniques your husband used, suspicious deaths of other wealthy women in this social circle, and financial transfers that connect to known human trafficking organizations," Marcus explained, spreading documents across my desk. "Eleanor Morrison's stepfather isn't just a gold digger, Sarah. He appears to be part of a network that systematically targets and eliminates wealthy women for their assets, while providing cover for international criminal operations." The revelation that we'd uncovered another network similar to Rob's organization was both disturbing and oddly satisfying. It meant that more innocent people were in danger, but it also meant that my expertise was crucial for exposing criminals who thought they were too sophisticated to be caught. The skills that had saved my life were continuing to protect other vulnerable people from predators who assumed their victims would be too trusting, too isolated, or too naive to fight back effectively. We spent the afternoon analyzing the Morrison evidence and developing an investigation strategy that would expose the criminal network while protecting Eleanor Morrison from the immediate threat to her life. The process was eerily familiar, requiring the same combination of financial analysis, behavioral assessment, and strategic planning that had been necessary to survive Rob's murder plot. "How many of these networks do you think are operating around the country?" Marcus asked as we reviewed connection maps that showed potential links between the Morrison case and similar suspicious activities in other states. "More than law enforcement realizes," I replied, thinking about the patterns we'd identified during the past year of consultation work. "These criminals are incredibly sophisticated, and they've learned to exploit weaknesses in our legal and financial systems that most people don't even know exist. They target victims who are isolated, vulnerable, or too embarrassed to report suspicious behavior until it's too late." The phone rang with a call from Agent Patricia Walsh, who'd become both a professional colleague and personal friend during the months since Rob's arrest. Her anti-corruption task force had been promoted to a permanent federal unit specifically focused on investigating financial crimes targeting elderly Americans, and she frequently consulted with my team on complex cases. "Sarah, we've got a situation in Arizona that has similarities to your husband's operation," Agent Walsh explained. 3 wealthy widows have died in apparent accidents over the past 18 months, all within 6 months of remarrying younger men who'd been introduced to them through the same exclusive dating service. The local authorities are treating them as isolated incidents, but the patterns are too consistent to be coincidental. The Arizona case represented exactly the kind of systematic predation that Rob's network had specialized in, and I felt the familiar surge of determination that came with identifying a new threat to innocent people. "What do you need from us?" "Full analysis of the financial and behavioral patterns, victim profiles, and connection mapping to identify the scope of the operation," Agent Walsh replied. "We need to know if this is an isolated regional network or part of a larger organization that's operating nationwide." I accepted the Arizona consultation immediately, knowing that every day we delayed could mean another victim falling prey to criminals who'd perfected the art of murder disguised as tragic accident. The work was emotionally challenging because each case reminded me of how close I'd come to becoming another statistic. But it was also deeply meaningful because it represented the transformation of my trauma into protection for other people. That evening, I sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson, reflecting on the journey that had brought me from Rob's intended victim to someone who spent her days hunting down predators like him. The woman who'd been married to a criminal for 20 years without recognizing his true nature had been replaced by someone who could identify sophisticated criminal behavior from thousands of miles away. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Lisa Martinez, the therapist who'd helped me process the trauma of discovering that my husband had planned to murder me. Thinking of you today as the trial officially concludes. Remember that your survival and success aren't just personal victories. They're inspiration for every woman who's been told she's too old, too naive, or too powerless to fight back against those who would harm her. Dr. Martinez was right. The story of my battle against Rob's criminal empire had resonated with women around the world who'd faced similar betrayals, or found themselves underestimated by those who sought to take advantage of them. I received dozens of letters each week from women who'd been inspired to investigate suspicious behavior in their own relationships, to trust their instincts when something felt wrong, or to seek help when they felt trapped in dangerous situations. One letter particularly stood out, from a woman in Texas whose elderly mother had been targeted by a romance scammer similar to Madison Chen. The daughter had recognized the warning signs after reading about my case and had contacted law enforcement before her mother could be financially devastated or physically harmed. The scammer was eventually arrested and connected to a network that had defrauded over 200 elderly victims across the Southwest. Your story gave me the courage to act on my suspicions instead of worrying about embarrassing my mother or causing family drama, the daughter had written. Because of your example, I knew that trusting my instincts and taking decisive action was more important than maintaining family harmony or avoiding difficult conversations. These letters reminded me that Rob's attempt to destroy me had inadvertently created something much larger than he'd ever imagined. His betrayal had transformed a successful, but relatively conventional marketing consultant into a nationally recognized expert on financial elder abuse and romantic fraud. His criminal network's downfall had led to federal legislation strengthening protections for vulnerable adults and improving coordination between law enforcement agencies investigating financial crimes. Most satisfying of all, Rob's assumption that his aging wife would be easily discarded had been proven spectacularly wrong. The woman he'd dismissed as too old to be valuable had become someone whose expertise was sought by federal agencies, whose consulting practice generated more income than his real estate development company ever had, and whose reputation for intelligence and integrity stood in stark contrast to his legacy as a convicted murderer and criminal conspirator. The next morning brought news that would have been impossible to imagine 18 months earlier. Agent Walsh called to inform me that the Department of Justice was creating a new task force, specifically focused on investigating organized criminal networks that targeted wealthy elderly Americans through romantic manipulation and financial fraud. The Sarah Mitchell Task Force, named in recognition of my role in exposing the scope of these crimes, would coordinate investigations across multiple federal agencies and work with experts like me to identify and dismantle criminal organizations before they could claim additional victims. Your case has become the template for understanding how these networks operate, Agent Walsh explained. The investigative techniques you developed, the evidence patterns you identified, and the strategic approach you used to expose the criminals while protecting yourself have been incorporated into federal training programs for agents working on similar cases. The honor was overwhelming, but what mattered most was knowing that my experience would help protect other people from the kind of systematic predation I'd survived. Every agent trained using my case study, every investigation technique refined through my experience, every criminal network exposed using similar methods represented another victory over the forces that had tried to destroy me. The irony wasn't lost on me that Rob's attempt to eliminate me as a threat to his criminal empire had instead resulted in my becoming a much greater threat to criminals like him than he'd ever imagined. His plan to murder me and start fresh with Madison had led to both of them spending decades in federal prison, while I built a new life dedicated to hunting down predators who targeted vulnerable people. 6 months later, I stood before a congressional committee investigating financial crimes against elderly Americans, testifying about the need for stronger protections and better coordination between law enforcement agencies. The hearing room was packed with family members of victims, law enforcement officials, and journalists covering what had become a national discussion about protecting vulnerable Americans from sophisticated criminal networks. Honorable committee members, the criminals who operate these networks are not opportunistic predators acting on impulse, I testified. They are sophisticated professionals who study their victims carefully, exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities, and use complex financial instruments to hide their crimes. Traditional law enforcement approaches are often inadequate because these criminals operate across state lines, use technology to mask their activities, and target victims who are embarrassed to report suspicious behavior. The committee was particularly interested in my recommendations for improving victim protection and criminal detection, strategies that had emerged from my personal experience surviving Rob's murder plot, and my subsequent work exposing similar criminal networks. The legislation that eventually resulted from these hearings would strengthen penalties for financial elder abuse, improve information sharing between law enforcement agencies, and provide funding for victim advocacy programs. As I answered questions from senators and representatives who were genuinely committed to protecting vulnerable Americans, I thought about how completely my life's purpose had been transformed by Rob's betrayal. The woman who'd spent 20 years supporting her husband's career while maintaining a modest consulting practice had become someone whose expertise influenced federal policy and whose story inspired legislation protecting millions of elderly Americans. The final question came from Senator Patricia Morrison, an elderly woman whose own mother had been victimized by a romance scammer similar to the networks I'd exposed. Ms. Mitchell, what would you say to women who find themselves in situations similar to what you experienced? Women who suspect betrayal but feel powerless to act because they've been told they're too old, too naive, or too dependent to protect themselves? The answer came from the depths of my experience. From the terror of discovering Rob's murder plot, from the satisfaction of seeing him sentenced to life in prison, from the fulfillment of using my trauma to protect other people, I would tell them that age brings wisdom, not weakness. That intuition developed over decades of life experience is a powerful tool for recognizing danger. That the skills they've developed in their careers, their relationships, and their communities are assets they can use to fight back against those who would harm them. I paused, thinking about the recording equipment that had captured Rob's confession, the investigative techniques that had exposed his criminal network, the federal agents who'd positioned themselves to save my life when he tried to murder me. Most importantly, I would tell them that they are never alone if they're willing to reach out for help. Law enforcement agencies, victim advocacy organizations, and professionals like me are ready to provide support and resources to anyone who finds themselves targeted by these predators. The hearing concluded with commitments from committee members to pass comprehensive legislation addressing financial elder abuse and romantic fraud. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave, several audience members approached to thank me for my testimony and share their own stories of surviving similar betrayals. One woman particularly touched my heart, an elderly widow whose adult children had helped her escape a relationship with a man who'd been systematically isolating her from family and draining her savings. Your story gave my daughter the courage to confront me about what she was seeing, the woman explained. I was embarrassed and defensive at first, but when she showed me the patterns you'd identified in your case, I realized I was being manipulated by someone who saw me as nothing more than a source of money. These conversations reminded me that Rob's betrayal, devastating as it had been, had ultimately led to something much more valuable than the marriage I'd lost. The experience had revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed, connected me with work that felt genuinely meaningful, and given me the opportunity to protect other people from the kind of systematic predation I'd survived. As I flew back to Boulder that evening, watching the lights of cities pass beneath the aircraft, I reflected on how completely the power dynamic between Rob and me had been reversed. He'd planned to murder me because he saw me as a threat to his criminal empire and an obstacle to his happiness with Madison. Instead, his attempt to eliminate me had resulted in my becoming a nationally recognized expert whose work would protect countless other potential victims. Rob was spending the rest of his life in a federal prison cell, probably still wondering how his perfect murder plan had been turned against him so completely. Madison was serving her own lengthy sentence. Her dreams of luxury lifestyle, funded by criminal proceeds replaced by the reality of federal incarceration. The entire network they'd been part of had been dismantled, with dozens of co-conspirators facing similar fates. Meanwhile, I was living a life of purpose and meaning that I'd never imagined possible during my years as Rob's wife. The work was challenging and sometimes emotionally difficult, but it provided the kind of deep satisfaction that came from using personal trauma to protect other people from similar harm. The plane began its descent toward Denver, and I could see the lights of Boulder in the distance, welcoming me home to the life I'd built from the ashes of Rob's betrayal. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new criminals to expose, new victims to protect. But tonight, I would sit on my back porch and watch the stars appear over the Rocky Mountains, grateful for the journey that had transformed me from Rob Mitchell's intended victim into someone who spent her days hunting down predators like him. The prey had indeed become the predator, and Rob's biggest mistake hadn't been underestimating a 48-year-old woman. His biggest mistake had been choosing to betray a woman who possessed the intelligence, determination, and skills necessary to transform his attempt at destruction into a force for justice that would protect countless other innocent people. The woman he'd planned to murder for being too old and inconvenient had become someone whose expertise was sought by federal agencies, whose story inspired legislation protecting vulnerable Americans, and whose work ensured that criminals like him would face consequences for their actions. Rob Mitchell had wanted to replace his aging wife with a young criminal who shared his complete lack of conscience. Instead, he'd created his own worst nightmare, a formidable adversary who understood exactly how criminals like him operated and possessed the resources to destroy them completely. The final victory wasn't just personal justice or financial recovery. It was the knowledge that every case I solved, every criminal I exposed, every victim I protected, represented another small victory over the forces that had tried to destroy me. And in a world where too many predators assumed their victims would be too powerless to fight back, that knowledge was the most satisfying revenge of all. 5 years had passed since that terrifying morning when I'd overheard Rob planning my murder, and the woman staring back at me from the bathroom mirror bore little resemblance to the naive wife who'd once trusted blindly in her husband's devotion. The lines around my eyes told stories of sleepless nights spent investigating criminal networks, but they also reflected the deep satisfaction that came from work that truly mattered. At 53, I'd never felt more powerful or purposeful. The silver streaks in my hair, which Rob had once suggested I cover with expensive treatments to maintain my youthful appearance, now served as visible proof that age had brought wisdom rather than weakness. The hands that trembled when I'd first discovered his betrayal now moved with steady confidence as I analyzed financial documents that would expose the next predator targeting vulnerable victims. The voice that had once shaken with fear during those early conversations with federal agents now commanded attention in congressional hearing rooms and law enforcement briefings. My morning routine had evolved into a ritual of empowerment that would have been unimaginable during my marriage to Rob. Instead of checking my appearance obsessively to meet his impossible standards, I reviewed case files that would protect other women from the kind of systematic betrayal I'd survived. Instead of preparing breakfast for a husband who was planning my destruction, I coordinated with federal task forces working to dismantle criminal networks across the country. The phone on my desk buzzed with a priority alert from Agent Walsh, now the director of the federal task force that bore my name. Another case had emerged in Florida. Another wealthy widow whose much younger husband exhibited the same behavioral patterns that had characterized Rob's approach to financial manipulation and murder planning. The familiar surge of determination filled my chest as I prepared to deploy the investigative techniques that had saved my life and destroyed Rob's criminal empire. Rob Mitchell had wanted to replace his aging wife with a 20-year-old criminal because he believed youth and beauty were more valuable than intelligence and experience. Madison Chen had agreed to participate in murdering me because she thought an older woman would be easy prey for their sophisticated schemes. Both of them were now spending decades in federal prison, their dreams of luxury and criminal success replaced by the harsh reality of consequences for their actions. Meanwhile, the woman they'd dismissed as too old to matter had become someone whose expertise protected countless innocent people from predators, who made the same fatal error in judgment that had destroyed Rob's plans. Every case I solved, every criminal I exposed, every victim I saved represented another victory over the forces that had tried to convince me I was powerless because of my age. The greatest satisfaction came not from personal revenge, though Rob's life sentence provided a certain grim pleasure, but from the knowledge that his attempt to destroy me had inadvertently created a force for justice that would continue protecting vulnerable people long after I was gone. The investigative techniques developed during my survival of his murder plot were now taught to federal agents nationwide. The behavioral patterns I'd identified were used to detect similar criminal networks before they could claim victims. The legislative changes inspired by my testimony would protect elderly Americans for generations to come. As I prepared to leave for another day of hunting down predators who preyed on those they considered weak and disposable, I paused to appreciate the complete transformation of my life's purpose. Rob had seen me as an obstacle to be eliminated, a liability to be discarded, when I'd outlived my usefulness to his criminal ambitions. Instead, his betrayal had revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed, and connected me with work that felt like a calling, rather than simply a career. The woman Rob had planned to murder for being too old and inconvenient had become his worst nightmare, an adversary with the intelligence to expose criminal networks, the determination to see justice served, and the resources to ensure that predators like him faced consequences for their actions. His attempt to silence me had instead amplified my voice to a national platform where I could protect countless other potential victims. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.